On the daily, many of us think about weight, we think about belly fat, changes in our skin. And if you're forgetful, maybe you think about dementia or how to prevent Alzheimer's. But for those of us with a genetic predisposition, who may have been caregivers for aging parents or loved ones who fought this, and maybe you work with older adults as a part of your job, preventing Alzheimer's is a more prominent thought. One of the greatest fears among older adults, however, is related to cognitive decline, no matter who you are. So, this episode on ways to prevent Alzheimer's, we talk about who's more prone to Alzheimer's, whether it's purely genetic and whether we're only at risk if we have the gene, as well as 5 ways to empower you. I might add, while we move off the couch, meaning go from sedentary, most frequently in pursuit of a physical goal or a physical motivator. The cognitive brain benefits of all exercise is well documented. Making sure that you're in the sweet spot, balancing stress levels is also a part of that, as we will talk about on the podcast. There are ways to not only have simple benefits for your brain by doing exercise, period, end of story. But there are ways to enhance your brain health by adding mental games like counting backwards from 100 while you're on a walk, trying to say the alphabet backwards, trying to recite a friend's phone number or do it backwards while you're walking. Those are just a few of the ideas that you can do to connect your kinesthetic benefit, meaning the movement, with actually cognitive changes. The other way is to follow choreography. That's new to you. My guest today is Dr. Efrat Lamondre. And yep, I practiced that. She owns and operates her own medical practice, EG Healthcare, which provides pediatric, adult, and geriatric care to over 20,000 patients. In addition to her primary care practice, she has taken conventional medicine to the next level with her signature process, the New Method. That's KNEW, y'all. And she helps patients take control of their health destiny using a functional medicine approach that empowers them to finally realize that their symptoms are not in their head. As a result, she helps people prevent illness, optimize their health instead, reduce medication, and feel great. I can't wait for you to meet her. I'm Deborah Atkinson. You're listening to Flipping 50, where I address your top struggles and concerns, and I share what to eat, how to move, and how to change your mindset so you can have the energy and vitality that you want, need, and deserve in this second and better half. Let's dive in. Dr. E, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure and honor.
And, I alluded to this in the intro, but, we can stand in front of the mirror while we're getting dressed or undressed and identify all kinds of things we want to nip, tuck, get more, get less of. This is not necessarily one of those things we think of on a daily basis, but it is one of those things that more and more in midlife women who are caregivers for parents or their in-laws or outlaws, or lately are becoming more familiar. We begin to worry about dementia and Alzheimer's, and what are really the odds of any one of us? And, I'm going to follow up with that. What's the prognosis?
Okay. So that's a great question. But first, I just want to take a moment to let everyone know that we are going to be a little forgetful. And just because we're forgetful does not mean that we have Alzheimer's or dementia. A lot of forgetfulness, myself included. I have found my keys in the refrigerator. And many of you listening are listening to the podcast while multitasking and doing something else. And when we attempt to multitask, we are sometimes forgetful. So please don't think that because you forgot something that you are developing Alzheimer's. And I just want everyone to exhale as we talk about this very anxiety-producing topic. To your question, though, I would say there's 2 main divisions or subgroups of people who are more likely to get Alzheimer's as a form of dementia. One is lifestyle dependent, and I'll get to that in a moment. And the other has a genetic predisposition to it. And I don't know if you wanted me to expound now or if you wanted to ask me some more questions before I go down my rabbit hole.
Well, talk a little bit about prognosis.
Okay, so the prognosis, it's controversial. There are, I would say, conventional medicine pretty much doesn't really have many solutions for this. There are some medications that try to approach it once Alzheimer's is already set in. There are some medications that try to manage different parts of the pathways, like whether it's the plaques, try to improve memory. But if you're coming with initial symptoms of memory loss, it tends to be like, hey, let's watch and see. There's like a wait and see approach. And then once it's there's some medications that really don't offer a lot of hope. They help momentarily, but it's kind of like, okay, we'll just watch and see where it goes. But in functional medicine and integrative medicine, there really is a conversation about lifestyle impacting, preventing, and reversing in some cases, depending on when it's caught. So I guess the prognosis depends on which school of thought you come from.
Well, I want the best odds possible for myself, but
Yes.
I'm going to just guess I'm speaking for listeners too. So I want you to come back to obviously the name of the podcast. We've alluded to this, but what's the Alzheimer's gene and how do you test for it?
Okay, great question. This is a gene this is a test that you can do in any normal conventional labs. It doesn't have to, it's not one of these kind of more esoteric labs. So you can ask any of your providers to do a LabCorp Quest. It's covered by insurance. So it's called APOE, which is a gene. Everyone has a version of the gene. And there's 3 versions to this gene, 2, 3, and 4. The population is divided into 2s, 3s, and 4s, and you're going to get one from each parent. Like you may get a 2-3, a 3-3, a 3-4. So let's tell you what they mean. Most of the population are 3s. 3s are kind of the middle of the road. Depending on how they live their life, they may or may not get Alzheimer's, and I'll get to lifestyle in a moment. The 2s are very unlikely to get Alzheimer's. There's something about the way they process lipids that makes it a little bit protective. And the 4s are genetically predisposed to Alzheimer's. That doesn't mean you're definitely getting it. And I always say that because sometimes people say, well, I don't want to take this test. I don't want to know. And I challenge that because I would say I want to know because I want to do everything possible to prevent it. If you have this gene, you want to double down and get really aggressive with your lifestyle changes. And then you could be a 4-4, which would make the highest genetic likelihood of getting Alzheimer's, or you could be a 3-4 and a 2-4. So that's the test that we're talking about, that you might have genetic predisposition.
Okay, so let's say I don't have genetic predisposition. I chose my parents well. Does that mean I'm going to use this word, immune?
Great question. So I like to explain this kind of with diabetes because everyone gets the diabetes metaphor in this case. So if I have a family history of diabetes, I am more likely to get diabetes, which means if I eat the food, the carbs and the pizza, I am more likely to get diabetes because it's in my family history. However, I don't have to get diabetes, right? Because if I never eat that stuff, I won't express that gene. And that's the same is true if I don't have a family history of diabetes. I don't have the genes for diabetes. But if I keep eating the high carb diet, I will still get diabetes. So Alzheimer's is called type 3 diabetes, which means if you live a certain way, even if you have that genetic 3-3, if you live a certain way and you're doing that for many, many years, you still may get Alzheimer's. In fact, diabetes, people with diabetes are 3 times more likely to get Alzheimer's.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about double down on lifestyle habits. What does that look like? Does that mean
Okay.
blueberries and walnuts or what else?
Blueberries and walnuts, like my favorite pancake. Um, so I, at the very least, I want all of you listening to imagine what kind of diet you would be on if you were diagnosed with diabetes, because people have a general sense of what that means. So at the very least, you should be on a low carb diet. Whatever you would imagine it would take to reverse diabetes or prevent diabetes is where the literature is pointing to for Alzheimer's.
Hmm.
But if you really, really want to double down, especially if you have the genes, you're going to have to go even more. I would say no grains as the only carbs that you should have if you're really like, genetically predisposed would be, fruits and vegetables should be your carbs, no grains at all. Intermittent fasting is a huge, huge player in the anti-inflammatory needed for Alzheimer's prevention. Because let me stop there and say why I'm saying anti-inflammatory. Alzheimer's is a neuroinflammatory process. Your brain's on fire, it's inflamed. And we know that there are certain things that turn on inflammation, such as sugar and carbs, and there are certain things that reduce inflammation. And fasting is one of those things that reduce inflammation. So intermittent fasting, I know it's very popular, I know it's very trendy, but it really works for so many things. What happens in intermittent fasting is you kind of toggle on the switch in your body where instead of needing an external source of fuel, you use an internal source of fuel. It's called gluconeogenesis, and your liver turns to the fat stores and converts it into sugar. And so that's why when you're fasting, you're not necessarily hungry. You can kind of get by. But what happens in that process of having the fat turned into glucose is it releases ketones. That's what people call keto, that kind of trendy word. And that ketosis is very anti-inflammatory and is great for the brain. So doubling down would be on the spectrum from what you would consider to be kind of a anti-diabetic diet all the way to no grain, no dairy, minimal sugars, even if it's from fruit, with intermittent fasting.
Beautiful. Okay. We like to talk about exercise here. And
Yes.
and if you give me the wrong answer, I'm going to have to edit it out. But so here's what we know when you've said, okay, it's think about what you do if you had diabetes. So in terms of strength training builds muscle that acts like a sponge for blood sugar. That's known for enhancing mood and cognitive function as well. Is it also as supportive for reduction in risk of Alzheimer's?
1,000%.
Oh, that was the right answer.
You don't need to edit my answer. I mean, I started with food, but that's not the whole lifestyle conversation. So exercising, and for your listeners, even just do something. Just walking. There's studies that just show that walking helps with prevention of Alzheimer's. You just have to get off the couch. Certainly strength training that you alluded to is going to help even more, but just anywhere you can get on the spectrum, right? Because some patients are just so, they're kind of so unwell that maybe it takes them, they're not quite ready for that, but just start somewhere. Exercise is truly, there are so many studies and so much like causative, not even correlative, causative for prevention of dementia and Alzheimer's. So get moving.
Fantastic. So if you had somebody sitting across the Zoom from you, I mean, we don't even say in the same room as you, and you were looking at, all right, here's what we're looking at. You've got risk, you've got the gene, and you were looking at sleep versus dietary changes and exercise. Is there a highest priority? What would you say?
Goodness.
Oh, I'm making you choose, and there's a gun to your head. Yeah.
Okay. If you made me choose and there's a gun to my head, I would 100% have to say nutrition.
Yeah.
Because it's constant, because nutrition is also toxic, right? If we're eating all this like yucky food, trans fat, and processed foods, you're actually poisoning yourself. So where, exercise and sleep it's like, let's add to this, but the food, like at the very least, to have to remove potential poisons and toxins, I would have to choose that. But please don't make me choose.
Well, we want it all. I get it.
Okay. But I do want to talk about sleep for a moment, if I may.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so sleep, there, growing up, at least for me, there's always this conversation that successful people don't sleep, and early bird catches the worm, and the 7 habits of successful people, you wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. Okay, it's just hogwash. Please, you have to sleep. You don't have to wake up at 4 a.m. and, try to conquer the world. It's really not good for you. There are there's a million things that's amazing about sleep, but there's two I want to bring to light. One is that our brain is equipped with something called a glymphatic system, which is different than lymphatic. It starts with a G, glymphatic system. It's basically a drainage system for your brain, and it kind of removes all the gunk you accumulated from the day. And it only happens in deep sleep and prolonged sleep, not cat naps. And so if you don't get that 7 to 8 hour sleep, you're not draining, and the next day you're going to wake up foggy. And the other thing is something called growth hormones. Growth hormones, as you can imagine, little munchkins, they get bigger because they're releasing growth hormones 24 hours a day. But as adults, we only release it at night. And that growth hormone is restorative and it repairs. And if we don't sleep, we don't access that. So sleeping is so much more than just rest. It's really a moment for your brain to repair and heal. And again, sound redundant, but causative, as studies have shown, it's causative for Alzheimer's, a lack of sleep. So you have to sleep. That's why making me choose is so hard.
Yeah. Okay. So you said sleep. So I'm going to go here to the next part, because if you don't get sleep, you've caused stress. So talk a little bit about the stress monster, which is, I think it's like squeezing silly putty in your hands. I mean, it's just so hard to literally talk about what is stress for one person versus another. What does it mean to get a handle on stress? But are there direct connections between stress and Alzheimer's?
So I would say, oh my God, so many good questions in that question. So first of all, you're right. It's each person's stress level is different. So it's perceived stress, right? Mm-hmm. So you can't compare. You can't say, well, how could you say you're stressed? You only do this. And, I have 5, things in there, good for you. But for me, this one thing is very stressful. And for you, those 5 things are not stressful. So you can't really compare, objective things that are happening in people's lives. If you are perceiving it as stressful, it's stressful. And I want to take the conversation from just stress, which we kind of look at as kind of like this amorphous concept, and really talk about cortisol levels, which is our stress hormone. Mm-hmm. Cortisol levels are designed, cortisol does a lot of beautiful things in our body, but one of the things it's supposed to do is wake us up in the morning. So you're supposed to have this perfect cortisol curve, high in the morning, slowly goes down throughout the day, and then lowest at night when melatonin takes over and you're sleeping peacefully. And that's the perfect curve. And that's how you would measure if you're stressed. So there's actually a way to measure it. So if you're what we call a phase 0 cortisol curve, then you're not stressed. You're not overproducing cortisol. You're not overusing cortisol. But for many of us, when we're stressed, and stress doesn't have to be just your lifestyle. It could just be managing chronic pain. People who have constant back pain, joint pain, like or managing a chronic issue that they're constantly dealing with day after day. That's stress also. What will happen is for you to get through the day, because you're a high performer, you want to get your stuff done, you're going to go to your adrenals, your cortisol bank, and you're going to say, hey, I need some cortisol. I'm really stressed out. Can you help me out? And the adrenals are going to be like, sure, here you go. Here's some cortisol. And like any bank, if you keep withdrawing, you go into overdraft. That overdraft is called adrenal fatigue. By the way, this is more of a holistic functional concept. So if you're going to go running to your endocrinologist, they will tell you this does not exist. That's okay. This talk is not for them. So this adrenal fatigue is actually measurable. So in a sense, your stress levels are measurable. And then there's 3 levels, 1, 2, and 3 of adrenal fatigue. So when you have this fatigue, this depletion of your cortisol levels, because you're so stressed out for whatever reason, you are running on empty. It's literally like looking at your gas tank. You're running on empty. And that stress is inflammatory. It brings us right back to inflammation, which is causative for Alzheimer's. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but
Mm.
I wanted to make it objective that stress is really a thing that we can measure and see.
No, it's beautiful. And I want to get in there and maybe wiggle this around a little bit. So, this pain point, I think what you described is what I'm about to say, but
Mm.
I want to do this from a health coach, from a personal trainer standpoint. I see this so very often that while you've described it's perception, it's somebody's perception, but I've also experienced that women suck at
Mm.
listening. And so sometimes their perception is, no, I'm fine. I got this. I'm good at covering all the bases. I'm so good. And I'm not all that stressed. And then you test their labs because it's like,
Yes.
we've looked at every other thing. And it's like, but you're doing all the right things. I can't crack this code. Let's look at what does the lab say. And then the lab test will come back and say, based on this, you should be wanting a nap at 11 a.m. And this doesn't make any sense. So talk a little bit about that for listeners.
Oh my God. You just described so many of my patient encounters. So I have the patient, some patients come in and clearly their labs are off and there's so much we need to manage. But I'll have the patients who come in and they're wiped. They're done. But they go from doctor to doctor and sorry, I was just trying to minimize the noise in the background, but all I did was make more noise. So
Forgiven.
Thank you. So they're just exhausted. And you're right, especially women, because we are taught to just push through, don't complain, don't whine, and you have to do for your children, you have to do for your parents, you have to do for your partners, you have to do for your job, you have to do it all, and never be perceived as weak, heaven forbid. So they come in and everything is fine. And this is why when I meet new patients, I insist on doing the saliva test, the adrenal test I just told you about, because I'll be like, wow, everything looks normal. Let's take a look at your adrenal fatigue. Hi, you're a phase 3. You're completely exhausted. You have nothing left. And this moment for these women is so empowering. They take the graph home to their partners and they're like, you see, I'm not lazy. It's not in my head. Like there's a reason why it's hard for me. And I want to go back to the exercising piece. These people are exhausted after exercising. All their friends feel great after exercising. They're going shopping or going to work, and they need to take a nap, as you alluded to, after working out because they used all the reserves to get through the workout. And they don't understand it. And they're like, what's wrong with me? I just worked out and I need to take a nap. I can't even function. It's because, for patients with phase 3 adrenal fatigue, I actually tell them, don't exercise right now. Mm-hmm. Let's strengthen you. And then they come to me a week or two later and say, wow, guess what I did this week? I worked out for the first time without being exhausted. So, but you can imagine the negative self-talk for how many years because they're so lazy. They can't work out. And in fact, that was never the case.
Yeah, beautifully said. And I'm so glad to have reinforcements because so often this is a pattern, though, that women will do this often. So listeners, we're seeing this with love and respect. Okay.
Yes.
We totally get that you're like, I am the army all by myself. I got this. And often you do, like you go to that intense workout, you'll do that, and then you'll be on the couch for 3 days. Mm-hmm. You'll finally recover, but next week you will do it all over again.
Oh my God.
Please stop. Please stop.
Yes.
And it's not you. It's not that you caused that necessarily, certainly not intentionally, but it's that the solution to that is not pushing through.
Oh my God, Deborah, I'm so glad of all the sentences you just said because it is so hard, especially for high performers to hear that. And then there's a whole conversation that's selfish, right? Taking time for your self-care is selfish. Taking time for yourself is selfish. You know what? I'm going to just use the language that you want to keep taking care of everyone. So for their sake, take a moment for yourself,
Mhm.
because you will not be able, I'm not even going to try to appeal to you for your sake, because for some of you, that's not going to work. So if you want to keep being the amazing caregiver that you are to whoever is in your life, you cannot pour from an empty cup. You must replenish. And and this should be a red flag for you. If you are exhausted after working out, this is a red flag that you really, really, now, first of all, I always say first, go to your PCP, make sure there's nothing more serious going on, never self-diagnose. But if everything else is fine, consider this as a diagnosis and replenish, because otherwise you're setting yourself up for a much bigger issue than just being fatigued after workout. So if you're that fatigued and you're that drained, imagine now getting a cold or a flu or some other virus. It's just going to knock you out. You're not going to have the resilience needed to recover.
Beautifully said. And so I also want to kind of say this, and I want to come full circle, because I know this is just a piece of what you do, but because this is your first time here, you didn't know this. And do you see what I did there? I invited you back without inviting you back, just saying.
I love
But
it.
the number one tenet, and there are 10 of Flipping 50, is restore before more.
Mm.
It's not like, what's your next workout? What's the best workout? It's, well, no, let's see if you even should be working out. Yeah.
Oh my, I can't, I'm so glad you said that. I really have patients, and I tell them, because when we work with our patients, right, we have nutrition, we have sleep, stress, and we have exercise. And with these patients, I'm like, we're skipping this whole section. I'm not talking about exercise. Don't take a walk. Don't do anything. We're going to come back to this in a few weeks. And when we feel, and it's hard for them, right? It's hard for them, but I restore before more. I love it.
Well, and to what you said, I think this is like not using your medical degree at all. And then yet again, it is, because this is so foundational, but we reach for like strategy. We reach for, give me the tactile thing I can do, instead of like things I can be, which is what we're asking them to do.
That's true, because people want to be able to do something, as opposed to, and we're asking them to be inactive, right?
Yeah.
And I'm glad you said like medical degree. So my first, I'm mentioning this for a reason. So my first degree is a family nurse practitioner, and then I got my doctorate in integrative medicine. So I didn't come to this from the MD standpoint. And the reason I mention that, and I love MDs, and many of them are my friends, and they're wonderful people, but in their schooling, there's no conversation about this. In fact, if your listeners are going to their primary care, they're just going to tell them, you need to exercise. You need to move.
Yeah.
Oh, you're tired? It's because you don't exercise enough. So you're getting this information about doing this from people that are well respected, who went to school. God bless them. But when we come to it from this approach, from an integrative perspective, exactly what you said, that you restore before more. And that is, it's hard to swallow, not just because people want to do more, but because they're constantly being told from day one that they should be doing more.
Yeah. Yeah. Externally and internally, right? They tell themselves.
Yes.
So I want to come back to your introduction. I talked about the new method. We're talking KNEW to listeners who can't see it here. But what prompted you to start the new method? And so many of us end up teaching or doing something we wish we would have happened. Do you have a personal journey, or
I do.
Where did this come from? Yes.
It's such a great question, because when I went back to study this, everyone who studied this came for a personal reason. Either they were suffering or their loved one was suffering. And it sometimes takes that for you to realize that you don't know enough. So I started off in primary care. The primary care company is called EG Healthcare. And just like all of your primary care, I did the thing. I did the annual visits, and I took care of my patients and sent them for mammograms. And I still do that. It's still, of course, important. But when my patients felt unwell and their labs were fine, I was like, you're fine. I'll see you next year. And I thought I was doing them a solid, because they're great. I had no idea how disempowering that was until my wife had a health issue. She had an autoimmune issue. She had 2 autoimmunes, and they tend to come in more than one. I won't go into that now. That's another podcast. So we searched everywhere, and she's in medicine, I'm in medicine, our friends are in medicine, and we just couldn't get a handle on it. And so someone told us about functional medicine, and we're like, okay. We rolled our eyes and we said, we have nothing to lose except for, some money. And we're like, okay, let's do it. And he did these crazy labs we never heard of, put us on this crazy diet that no one ever talked to us about autoimmune and diet in school. What? There's no connection. And he cured her. Like it completely cured her. She had, for those of you interested, she had 2, it's called PMLE, polymorphous light eruption. And she also had crazy form of psoriasis. So she couldn't walk or use her hands. And they're both gone. And I was like, what is this? So I started taking classes. I started slowly introducing it to my patients. And then I went all in, got the PhD, and created the new method. And it's entitled the new method because for so many of my patients, they just know. They either know that there's something going on and they're being told they're fine, or they know that there's a better way to do it. So the tagline is you always knew there was a better way, and they just inherently know. And then when they come to me and we are able to show them that they're right, there's this just moment of empowerment. They're like, yes, I knew it. And so the new method was born kind of from that concept.
So awesome. Love that. And, personally, I think it's much better to connect with someone as a allied health professional who actually has been there, who actually has experienced that frustration.
Yes.
Because to pun intended,
Exactly.
I could not do that. Okay.
but it's true, because until you experience it, until you have that frustration of there's got to be something out there, as I said, so many of my friends are conventional doctors, and they think I'm, crazy. And I'm like, oh, that's okay. And until you deal with something, and then you're going to be right in my office and we'll deal with it. And it's not an anti-pharma. It's not an anti-conventional medicine. I still practice primary care. I still prescribe if necessary. It's both worlds together according to what the patient needs. And it's just increasing the tools in the toolbox.
Love it. All right. Now, I have no doubt that listeners are going to want to connect. Where is the best place for them to find you?
Okay. So the new method, and again, the new is spelled with a K. So the new method on any platform that you like, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, you name it. It's all called the new method. And then, of course, thenewmethod.com if you want to send us a message. Any way you want to connect, my team and I are always checking messages.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here. And I got to say, anybody who's listening who didn't catch this, I'd be scratching my head. But your conviction, the strength of what it is you believe in, and that desire to help, come out so clearly in your voice. Thank you again for being here.
I appreciate that. I'm honored and humbled. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Okay, listeners, now it's up to you. It's your turn. So if you have a question that you wish I would have asked Dr. E, you can leave that below the show notes, and that'll be at flipping50.com/prevent Alzheimer's.